I think more than any other South African writers are accorded an opportunity to understand a very complicated country, a country that almost can't be apprehended or comprehended on a surface level. The history, the cultures, the 11 official languages, and the daily interactions, the gestures of the people, and what those gestures mean, require a lot of context. And they require some really deep reflection in order to try and approach what South Africanness is. And specifically for white South African writers, coming to terms with the fact that your privilege is not earned or justified, and why it's not earned or justified, enables you to hopefully live a life that's a bit more honest. Because if you take your privilege for granted in that country, you're very often part of the problem. For me, when I'm not in South Africa, when I'm living in another place, and I don't consider the IWP living in another place, I consider it a break from South Africa, but I have lived in other countries. And it's almost as if I don't cast a shadow. South Africa gives me a silhouette. It makes me feel like I'm walking in a place where my double is, my image of myself is. And it's very closely tied up to my identity. And everything I've just discussed in the previous question applies to that identity. So I suppose you're asking what I love about my identity. I mean, it's hard to love your image of yourself. I mean, one should try and not do that. But being comfortable in it and understanding it is imperative. So South Africa is, it's a mirror to my own self. My process of narrative nonfiction doesn't differ much from other sort of practitioners of the craft. And what I do is I divide the process into three parts, and they're just sui generis. They're natural parts of the process. And the first part is reporting, where you're out in the field and you're interviewing and you're visiting different locations and you're taking in all the sensory, all the tactile experiences of a place, so that you can make the non-fiction read like fiction, so that you can put the character in the scene. And that's an incredible, enjoyable process for me, because it enables me to see the world. The next process is transcribing, where you're taking all the interviews you've done, you're taking everything in your notebooks, and you're writing it up, and you're starting to see links in your broad story. And there were links that you hadn't thought about when you were reporting, and links you hadn't envisaged when you had decided to set out on a specific story. And seeing those links is rewarding as well, because what you're effectively seeing is connections between things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So your understanding is starting to deepen, and that's very rewarding. The most rewarding part of that process for me comes when I've got this big block of raw text, which is like a big chunk of marble, and I got to now come with a chisel, and I got to go at it until, to me, it's as beautiful as David. And whether or not the reader thinks I get there is not my responsibility. My responsibility is to make something beautiful out of this raw material. Well, I've done both. The first course I took was a 2-3 day narrative journalism course where the scales were lifted from my eyes. And I actually saw for the first time what it meant to write and what the craft was, how you actually could go about building a scene and how to go and do that practically. And I'd never bothered to learn before. I thought this was just something you either had or you didn't, which is kind of stupid, you know, given the fact that there's so much out there about the craft. So the scales were lifted, and then I started writing in a certain way. And at exactly that time, I joined another magazine where I convinced the editor, and I became a co-editor there, that long-form narrative journalism was the way to go here. And this became South Africa's sort of major narrative journalism destination and magazine, with Rian Milan, the likes of Rian Milan writing for it. We'd have 10,000 word articles. We had some fantastic stuff in there. And then I decided to do an MA in creative writing. And to get into that, I had to do an honours course with people who were 10 years younger than me for non-degree purposes, and I did that. And then I talked my way into the class, and it was something I really wanted. And so I eventually got my MA with distinction in creative writing, and then was asked to come and be a supervisor on the course. And the workshop format, I believe, is something that is quite valuable. I mean, I'm very aware of the debates around it, around the MFA program, and how can you not be aware when you're in Iowa City, the birthplace of it all. But for me, the process of submitting your prose, and this is the most personal of your prose, because this is the book, and it's always the most personal. I mean, I developed a thick skin over the years from being a journalist, and I take a lot of flack as a South African journalist, because you do. But nothing prepared me for how vulnerable I'd feel when your baby's out there and your colleagues and your peers are evaluating it. But learning to hear the criticism and learning to take the best of it is a key part of the learning process. I don't believe anybody should do 2 MFAs. If you've done it, you've done it. That's you know what it is. You now can write. You're no longer an apprentice. So go out and do the thing. But that process was very important in my development. I read fiction regularly. I don't know what regular is anymore. I mean, on a deadline for a book like I'm on now, you just have to be focusing on your topic. So fiction has to be fantastic for me to read it. It really has to stand out. And what comes to mind immediately, and I know this might be controversial to some because they didn't like the book, was Franson's Freedom. It needs to be something that important for me to read if I'm going to sit through a book that big. Poetry, yes and no. I haven't been reading much poetry lately, but being surrounded by the poets on the IWP, I think the last 2.5 months I've read more poetry than I've probably read in the last 5 years, and it's been fantastic to be reminded of what's in there. So hopefully I'll keep that up. It's a difficult one, because the writer needs to be immediately distrustful of a state that supports him or her. states sort of contributing to the arts in general, on the other hand, it's equally important to the life of a culture and to the vitality of a culture, and to preserving that culture, and to actually, first of all, to just understanding what that culture is. But to take a grant from the state, if it's offered, you take it, and you write what you were going to write anyway, and you assume that there's going to be no censorship, and 99 times out of 100 there isn't. I've taken money from the South African government for awards, and I've been very grateful, and I think it's a good thing that they've given these awards. But I think one has to be wary of. You've got to be wary of in which form they come. I think the Chinese example might be the perfect example, where the writers that are actually credited by the state as a sort of state-sanctioned writers. These are our writers. You know immediately that these are not the voices that you need to be reading. You need to be reading the ones that aren't. So how hard actually is it? Yeah. New York Times, New Yorker, Granta, Guardian. Dip into the Believer, the Atlantic, Harper's. Most of the classics. The Walrus in Canada is very good. I read that often. I found a fantastic new resource on the net called Byliner, where they've got the great writers and their archives. Actually, Vanity Fair is another. I've just discovered Nick Tuskus. So yeah, mainly the classics. When I come across a new title or periodical, I'll always look at it. But I come back to the staple diet. There is such a thing as African literature. It's quite simply literature that comes out of Africa. Does African literature have a distinct feel, and would you be able to recognize it? Again, the answer is yes, because the scenes are typically African, and the characters are typically African, and the scenarios are African scenarios. They're not Western scenarios, they're not Eastern scenarios, they're not Indian scenarios, they're African scenarios. And in that sense, African literature exists, and it is a body of work that can and should be studied as African literature because it talks about what Africa is. Others' attempts to lump Africa together becomes more problematic. I think Wally Shoyinka brought this up yesterday again, and I fully, I fully subscribe to this. Africa is not a country. Africa is over 50 countries with thousands of different cultures and dialects that can sort of be connected depending on what region you're in, but the difference between the Zulu and the Tuareg is the difference between night and day. I don't believe, well, it's not that I don't believe, it's a fact that the dominant Western cultures regard African literature as an afterthought, and possibly even worse, possibly even as inferior. In fact, probably even as inferior. In fact, definitely, they regard it as inferior. Let me not mince words. It's something that is recognized by African writers. We're very aware of it. We're all very aware of that. And we write into that, and very often we write around that, because we'll write for audiences that are not part of, the former colonial powers, that are not part of that world. We can be writing into India, we can be writing into the Caribbean, and we'll be reading their literature as well. So there's this whole world of literature that is happening outside the major publishing houses in New York and London. And that's quite exciting. It's quite exciting to be reading similar material that doesn't assume the Western stance. The standard of African literature is something that needs to be thought about. I mean, you need to make qualitative judgments, always. And there are certain instances where what gets published, certainly in South Africa, would not pass an editor in the States or in the UK. It would not. So there is quite a lot of unfinished material on the shelves in South Africa. And I'm not sure that that's a good thing. I don't believe in publishing for publication's sake, because it just results in a lowering of standards and a general laziness that filters through. The upper levels of South African literature are very robust and are fantastic, and there are certain people to aspire to. But there are certain publishing houses and certain writers who have won certain awards. You just ask yourself how and why. And there are answers. There are answers to these questions. And they really are answers I stay well away from. They're answers that I cannot afford to be interested in at all. Sometimes you will find an academic wading in and touching on it, and the whole thing will just explode. Yeah. I was looking at the certificate that you gave me yesterday, and I never thought it would be something that I'd look at and think, yeah, that's real cool. Honorary Writing Fellow at the University of Iowa. And that made me think a bit about what's actually happened, what I've done these last 2.5 months. And to be here in the heart of it, at the University of Iowa, where the Writers' Workshop was created, to be part of this program that Paul Engel founded in 1967, and to say that I was here in 2011 is important to me. It's important to me. It's another step in the process of becoming a writer, because I think it's something we're always becoming. I think maybe you get there at a certain point, but it's always, I think it's always active. It's always a walking towards or a getting towards. Very obviously, like life. So to have that, to have made that step, to have passed onto that little stone in, on the path, felt very satisfying yesterday. Felt very satisfying. It felt like more sort of confirmation that I'm doing, what I always wanted to do. And I think my writing is stronger for being here. We'll see in hindsight. I think the stuff that I've worked on here is